No red carpet. The Prime Minister's grin not exactly reciprocated by the Scottish First Minister. This is not how it usually goes. In the past, with his predecessors, Nicola Sturgeon was all smiles and small talk. The irony that Boris Johnson and his do-or-die, no deal if need be insistence might just make her political goal more likely. And from him, the tough talk was softened today.
My approach is to be very outward-going, I don't want the UK to be aloof or hanging back. I want us to engage, to hold out the hand, to go the extra mile, the extra 1,000 miles. I came in here by mistake. Oh, how are you? Nice to see you.
Hold out the hand, he says, while cranking up no-deal planning and spending, with a new Brexit task force dubbed the War Cabinet in London. Here, there was a tour of a submarine at Faslane. The job, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, comes with the nuclear codes. Boris Johnson, the man who would have his finger on the trigger.
Yes, so you need to take on ballast as you launch a missile. Yes, okay, right.
But today there was another issue to diffuse, because in Scotland, Brexit isn't just about Brexit. And Maxine, who works at Primark in Edinburgh, sums up the problem more clearly than you'll hear most politicians.
I never voted for independence, but now I'm thinking about it.
Why?
Because I don't think Boris Johnson should be the Prime Minister, and I think he's an idiot. And I'm extremely worried about what's going to happen, especially to my kids.
And for the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, that must have made for an interesting dynamic for her talks with the Prime Minister at Holyrood today. They met behind closed doors, but the cameras lined up for her after. No deal is her red line, but Ruth Davidson insisted the meeting was constructive and reassuring. By the same token, he talks about leaving the EU on Halloween, do or die. So how reassured are you actually, bearing in mind that you've been adamant that you can't support no deal?
Well, I don't support no deal, and the Prime Minister has made it very clear today, both in his meeting with me and speaking to journalists like yourself, that the primary objective of his government is to get a deal.
With Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, do you think it's more or less likely that people in Scotland will vote for your party?
Well, look, I want to build on the good work that we've done. Our prospects have gone up and down. My wins and losses are on the board. I'm now on my third Prime Minister.
You might think that is not exactly an answer. Playing nicely, for now perhaps. But for how much longer? Well, the protests that seem to follow Boris Johnson around today tell you that he is not a universally popular Prime Minister in Scotland, but as complicated as leaving the EU has proved to be, it is even more complicated in Scotland because of the arguments over Scottish independence and because Scotland voted strongly to remain in the EU. As he arrived today, the Prime Minister said that he is passionately committed to the Union, that he wants to strengthen the bonds and that he believes he can get a Brexit deal. But have a listen to what Nicola Sturgeon had to say after they met, because they are not on the same sheet right now.
Whatever Boris Johnson might be saying publicly about his preference being to strike a deal, in reality he is really pursuing a no-deal Brexit, because that is the logic of the hardline position that he has taken.
94 days until Brexit, ample time for us to agree on a deal, according to the Prime Minister. But there are plenty of people here who don't think his words are matching up with his actions.
Well, back in Westminster, the Prime Minister has created 3 new cabinet committees to oversee the delivery of Brexit. One of them, tasked with planning for no deal, met for the first time this afternoon and will meet every weekday from now on. However, the Confederation of British Industry said that neither the UK nor the EU are ready for no deal. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
The CBI says no deal will bring shocks in 24 separate sectors of the economy it has studied, whatever money the government's turbocharged preparations amount to in the next few weeks.
You can never be prepared to mitigate the economic shock. all you can do is try and mitigate as much as you can. But no, we're still in for a very damaging time if we hit no deal, and it has to be avoided.
The government's special No Deal Committee started the first of its daily meetings to boost preparations for No Deal Brexit.
We'll leave on the 31st of October. That's what's going to happen.
In Scotland, Boris Johnson sported a presidential-style Commander-in-Chief jacket. The Queen is actually the Commander-in-Chief of UK forces. He was asked about Michael Gove's claim that leaving with no deal was now the government's strongest expectation. Not, it seems, a remote 1,000,000 to 1 chance, as Mr Johnson called it in the leadership campaign.
The government's working assumption now has to be that there will be no deal with the EU. Is that your assumption?
No, absolutely not. My assumption is that we can get a new deal. We're aiming for a new deal. But of course, Michael is absolutely right that it's responsible for any government to prepare for a no deal if we absolutely have to. And that's the message I've been getting across to our European friends. And I'm very confident that we'll get there.
Exporting goods from the UK to the EU in a no-deal EU exit in 10 steps.
Ads like this one explaining no deal to business, put out in the spring this year, got barely 2,000 views online. Boris Johnson's government plans to splash £100 million on much higher profile advertising you will struggle to miss. Cutting a very different image from the last government, the new Foreign Secretary even suggested that ripping up the divorce deal Theresa May agreed with the EU and leaving with nothing agreed could make it easier to negotiate the future trading relationship between the UK and the EU.
I actually think the prospects of reverting and getting a good deal for the UK will be easier after we've left, if that's the case.
We've only really been doing the easy bit so far. We've done money, citizens' rights, the transition period, and obviously the very contentious Irish backstop. But the kind of relationship the UK wants to negotiate afterwards covers all aspects of the economic relationship and trade relationship, the security relationship. I mean, if you look at the EU's most ambitious trade agreements they've done, you're talking 4, 5, 6 years. So how, after an acrimonious no deal, you would then do something more ambitious in less time, it seems quite hard to imagine how you can have the kind of evidence to back that up.
The car manufacturer Vauxhall today said it could withdraw all production at Ellesmere Port on Merseyside and shift it to a southern European plant if a no-deal Brexit makes production here unprofitable. Most of the cars produced here are exported to the EU and could face tariffs of 10% if Britain leaves, rejecting Theresa May's divorce agreement and the standstill transition period that comes with it. Well, Boris Johnson was asked today whether he still truly believes that the chances of a no-deal Brexit are 1 in a million, and he said, yes, sure, subject to giant caveat, there is a sufficient goodwill and engagement from the EU, i.e. the EU goes along with more or less exactly what I'm asking them. People are just beginning to wonder, what is the real percentage probability of no deal that is clinking through Boris Johnson's mind as he embarks on this game of chicken? And you sense that that was very much in Ruth Davidson's mind today. In one of the interviews she gave, she talked about shuttle diplomacy. You sense that she wondered why it wasn't happening. Boris Johnson still hasn't gone off to see any of Europe's leaders. I understand there are phone calls happening between officials in London and Dublin, and maybe there'll be a phone call between him and the Irish Taoiseach in the next couple of days. But Boris Johnson is determined at the moment to sit this out and wait for Europe to come back and make him the offer he thinks they should make, and which they, of course, have completely ruled out.
Gary Gibbon. Well, no matter what Boris Johnson said today, all this renewed talk of a no-deal Brexit becoming a very real prospect has sent the pound tumbling. It's now at its lowest level against the dollar for 2 years. It's also fallen against the euro. Expensive times for anyone about to go on holiday. Well, with me now is the FT's Capital Markets editor, Katie Martin. Well, I mean, why are all these traders so defeatist? I mean, why don't they believe in Britain and no deal?
Well, I mean, sure, you could go to the trading floors in Canary Wharf and go and implore the traders to be more optimistic and more patriotic. But the fact is, there isn't a mainstream economist on the planet who really thinks that we can get through a no-deal Brexit without a pretty significant, at least short-term, shock to the economy. So The markets don't like what they're seeing at the moment. We've had a kind of phony war in sterling for quite a long time. We've kind of hovered around going nowhere while we've waited to see what the government's going to actually do. Now that things seem to be coalescing around this idea that we might leave without the deal, the markets don't like it. So the sterling has fallen pretty significantly today. I
mean, it's significant, but it's still a cent here, a cent there. I mean, how low would you expect it to go if this carries on? That
is the big question. And I speak to very sensible people in the markets who are not kind of out there looking for headlines. They're kind of very sensibly putting portfolios together and thinking, how bad could this get? People have talked about the pound falling as low as parity against the dollar. It's now at about $1.22. That would be brutal. It's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that it could fall to about 115, 110. And really the concern is that that wouldn't happen in a nice kind of gentle slope, that it would happen in a straight line. We saw that straight after the referendum in 2016. That was a very long night in the office. And that sort of movement in markets is not good for companies. It's not good for investors. It's just not good for confidence in the economy.
I mean, people do argue that if the pound falls, it's good for people trying to export, though. Is that true or not?
You can argue that, but it is somewhat more problematic than that. There's lots of academic material out there that says it actually takes quite a lot longer for these effects to come through. And actually, if you look at what would happen in terms of our trading relationship with our major trading partner, which is the EU, you look at what might happen to the Vauxhall plant in Ellesmere Port, for example, just the sheer practicalities of doing business in the UK would become a lot more complicated, and I don't think that would be outweighed by a drop in the pound. So, I mean, what is it that will sort of make them think that this is going to happen? I mean, will this, if there isn't a change, you know, how fickle is it, is what I'm asking. You know, if he has a meeting next week and comes out saying, oh, things are looking good, is it all going to go back up? It could well do, yes. But, you know, like I was saying, the fact is that we have sort of hovered around looking for a sign for quite some time. And the language that we've had out of number 10 for the best part of a week now, and the makeup of the cabinet that we've got, does all seem to be pushing in the same direction. Yes, it could turn around tomorrow if, for some strange reason, we're told by the government that there's going to be a deal after all.
Because the traders don't know what's going on politically, do they? They're just guessing.
No, they don't know, but they are pretty universal in their view. You know, it doesn't matter what your kind of political allegiance is. The cold, hard economics of it are that there isn't an economist alive or a trader alive who really thinks that sterling can get through this without getting really punched in the face.
Casey Martin, on that very visual metaphor. Thank you very much.